A captain of Navy SEALs? Really, Lily? That's not even a real title. Perhaps your mother packs boxes for them at the warehouse on the base. The words, slick with a practiced and weary condescension, slithered from Ms. Albright's lips and hung in the thick, unmoving air of the gymnasium. The crowd of fifth graders, a restless sea of bright t-shirts and nervous energy, erupted in a wave of stifled giggles and cruel snickers. They laughed. They always laughed when Ms. Albright sharpened her wit on a student. Lily Rostovas stood alone in the center of their judgment, a small, unmoving island in a hostile ocean. She did not cry. She did not flush with shame. Her small hands, which had been clutching a printed photograph of her mother in a simple Desert 10 flight suit, merely tightened their grip, the corners of the glossy paper digging into her palms. She simply stood there, her gaze fixed on the teacher, her expression unreadable, a perfect, miniature echo of a discipline she had absorbed through osmosis her entire life. But when the school's principal, standing by the bleachers, saw the girl's stance, shoulders back, chin level, eyes focused straight ahead as if acquiring a target, a flicker of unease disturbed his comfortable bureaucratic calm. He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt as if he were the one being evaluated. If you believe that true strength is measured not in volume, but in unwavering stillness, type competence below. Ms. Albright, however, saw only childish defiance, a stubborn refusal to accept the world as she, in her infinite and dreary wisdom, knew it to be. She mistook silence for insolence, composure for a lack of understanding. Today was career day, a day she personally loathed. It was a parade of predictable ambitions and parental exaggerations, a festival of mediocrity where firefighters and accountants and dental hygienists were presented as titans of industry. She saw her role as that of a necessary filter, a purveyor of grim reality to puncture the inflated balloons of childhood fantasy. Lily's claim was, to her, the most egregious of the day. It wasn't just an exaggeration, it was a structural impossibility, a fiction born of an overactive imagination or, more likely, a desperate parental lie whispered to a gullible child. The Navy had captains. The SEALs had commanders and chiefs and operators. The idea of a woman, let alone this quiet girl's unassuming mother, being a captain of Navy SEALs, was a laughable absurdity, an affront to the neat, orderly, and male-dominated hierarchy she had constructed in her mind from years of watching war movies and skimming news headlines. Lily, when you are asked to present your parents' career, you are expected to tell the truth, Ms. Albright continued, her voice amplifying in the cavernous space, enjoying the spotlight. Fabricating stories to impress your friends is not acceptable. It shows a lack of character. We will discuss this lack of character in detention this afternoon. The word detention was the final nail, the official seal on Lily's public humiliation. The laughter from the other children became bolder, more open. Lily's photograph was now a symbol of her lie, the woman in the flight suit a fictional hero in a tall tale. Yet, Lily's expression did not change. She accepted the punishment with the same unnerving calm, a quiet professionalism that was so alien in this room of loud emotions that it felt like a foreign language. She simply nodded once, a crisp, economical movement, and walked back to her place on the bleachers, her back ramrod straight. She sat down, placed the photograph carefully in her lap, and folded her hands. The other children scooted away from her, creating a small, invisible quarantine of shame around her. She was now the liar, the weird girl whose mother wasn't a hero but a source of second-hand embarrassment. Ms. Albright, satisfied with her work, clapped her hands together with an air of finality. All right, who's next? Let's hear about a real job, shall we? The day moved on. The droning litany of careers resumed, but the injustice of that moment lingered, a toxic cloud that settled over the gymnasium. The principal felt it. A few of the other parent volunteers felt it. And Lily Rostovas certainly felt it, not as a sting of shame, but as a cold, hard certainty. Ms. Albright had made a mistake. She had made an assumption. And Lily knew, with a faith as solid and unshakable as granite, that assumptions were the one thing her mother never, ever made. She had built a career on dismantling them with terrifying precision. The incident was a stone dropped into the placid pond of the school day, and the ripples of its injustice spread outward, touching everything. Ms. Albright, basking in the glow of her perceived victory over childhood delusion, felt a renewed sense of purpose. She saw herself as a guardian of truth, a necessary corrective force in a world filled with nonsense. She patrolled the hallways with a straightened spine, her authority validated by the public shaming of a 10-year-old girl. In her mind, she had not been cruel. She had been educational. She had taught a vital lesson about the difference between fantasy and the far more important, far more mundane reality of adult life. The other students, meanwhile, had absorbed the lesson she intended. Conformity was safety. They whispered about Lily in the lunch line, pointing and snickering. The girl who had claimed her mom was a super soldier was now an outcast, her story a cautionary tale against aspiring to be anything more than what was immediately believable. Lily, for her part, navigated the rest of her day with a stoicism that was both heartbreaking and deeply unsettling to the few adults who bothered to notice. She ate her lunch alone, her back to the wall, observing the room with a watcher's stillness. In art class, she drew a single, perfect compass rose in the center of a large white page, its lines clean and precise, its cardinal points unwavering. She did her math problems with methodical focus, each number placed in its box with deliberate care. She was not withdrawn, she was contained. It was as if she had retreated into a fortified position within herself, a place of quiet discipline that the outside world, with its loud mockery and ignorant assumptions, could not breach. Her silence was not a wound, it was a shield. She was waiting. She didn't know what for, exactly, but she knew the universe her mother inhabited was one of order and consequence. An imbalance had been created, an injustice had been registered, and in her world, such things were always, eventually, corrected. The final bell of the day was a shrill, jarring sound, a signal of release for everyone but her. For Lily, it was the prelude to her punishment, the formal beginning of her sentence for the crime of telling the truth. As her classmates burst out of the school's front doors, their shouts and laughter echoing in the afternoon sun, Lily walked the other way, down the long, quiet corridor toward Ms. Albright's classroom for detention. The hallway was unnaturally silent, the usual end-of-day chaos replaced by an echoing emptiness. The janitor's buffer droned in a distant wing of the building, a low, monotonous hum that seemed to underscore the loneliness of her journey. She clutched her backpack strap, the picture of her mother tucked safely inside a textbook. The image had become a talisman, a secret source of strength. It was a reminder that the world was larger and more complex than Ms. Albright's cramped and cynical classroom. Her mother was out there, somewhere, moving through that larger world with a calm competence that Lily could only begin to comprehend, a world where respect was not given but earned through action, where a person's worth was measured by their deeds, not by the uninformed opinions of others. She reached the classroom door. Through the reinforced glass window, she could see Ms. Albright sitting at her desk, grading papers with a red pen, each stroke a decisive, judgmental slash. The teacher looked up, her expression a mixture of impatience and satisfaction. It was the look of a person who believed she was about to perform a necessary, if unpleasant, duty. Lily took a deep breath, straightened her small shoulders, and prepared to enter the room, ready to serve her time with the same quiet dignity she had shown all day. She had her mother's blood. She would not break. The first sign of the coming storm was not a sound, but a feeling. It was a subtle shift in the atmospheric pressure of the school, a deep, resonant vibration that hummed up through the soles of the shoes of the few remaining staff members. The principal, Mr. Miller, felt it in his office as he was signing off on purchase orders. He paused, his pen hovering over the paper, a primal instinct telling him that something was fundamentally different about this particular Tuesday afternoon. The low, rhythmic hum was not the familiar growl of a school bus or the rumble of a passing truck. It was something else entirely, something more disciplined, more synchronized. It was the sound of purpose. Then came the visual. From his window, overlooking the main parking lot, Mr. Miller saw them. A procession of immaculate, unmarked black SUVs had pulled into the visitor spaces, their tinted windows revealing nothing, their presence an immediate and stark contrast to the fleet of minivans and sedans that usually populated the lot. They parked in perfect alignment, with a spatial precision that was almost unnerving. Doors opened in unison, and from them emerged figures that did not belong in a suburban elementary school's parking lot. They were men, dozens of them, all dressed in immaculate navy dress blue uniforms. They moved with an eerie, coordinated grace, a silent ballet of disciplined power. They did not speak. They did not look around at the colorful, child-friendly facade of the school. They formed up, two abreast, creating a long, formidable column that stretched from the curb to the school's main entrance. Their movements were economical, stripped of all superfluous gestures. They were a living, breathing demonstration of absolute order. The air itself seemed to grow still and quiet around them. The ambient noise of the afternoon, the distant traffic, the chirping birds, fading into a reverent hush. They were an island of profound seriousness in an ocean of mundane reality. At the head of this silent, imposing formation, two figures stood apart. One was a man whose uniform bore the unmistakable weight of high command, an admiral, his face a roadmap of hard-won experience and unwavering authority. The other was a woman. She was of average height, her dark hair pulled back in a severe regulation bun. Her dress blue uniform was perfectly tailored, adorned with a constellation of ribbons that spoke of a long and decorated career, and on her shoulder boards and sleeves shone the 4 golden stripes of a captain. It was the woman from Lily's photograph. But the picture, a candid shot in a dusty, sun-bleached flight suit, had captured none of the sheer, unadulterated presence she projected now. This was not just a soldier, this was a commander. Her posture was a masterclass in quiet authority, her gaze focused, her entire being radiating a calm, centered competence that was more intimidating than any overt display of aggression could ever be. She stood there, perfectly still, the silent, undisputed epicenter of the disciplined force arrayed behind her. Mr. Miller felt a cold sweat prickle his forehead. He had dealt with angry parents, school board inquiries, and even a small kitchen fire, but he had never in his 20 years as an educator felt a sense of such overwhelming, world-altering gravity. He watched as the captain exchanged a few quiet words with the admiral, her expression unchanging, professional. The admiral nodded, then took a half-step back, a subtle but clear deferral of command. The captain then turned her gaze toward the school's front doors. It was not a threatening look. It was a look of simple, direct intent. She was here for a reason, and Mr. Miller had a sudden, sinking feeling that he knew exactly what that reason was. The main doors of the school did not burst open. They were pulled open with a smooth, controlled motion by 2 of the operators, who then stepped aside and stood like stone sentinels. Captain Eva Rostova stepped across the threshold, her polished black shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. The 40 men of her command staff and senior operators from Naval Special Warfare Group 1 followed, their movements so synchronized that the sound of their footsteps was a single, soft, rhythmic beat, like a distant drum announcing the arrival of something inevitable. The effect on the school's interior was immediate and absolute. A janitor, pushing a wide dust mop down the main hall, froze mid-stride, his mouth agape. A secretary, walking toward the office with a stack of files, simply stopped, the papers slipping from her suddenly numb fingers and scattering across the floor in a silent explosion of white. The building itself seemed to be holding its breath. The silence that fell was not empty. It was heavy, profound, charged with a palpable energy. It was the silence of a cathedral, the silence of a tomb, the silence that precedes a verdict. Ms. Albright, in her classroom, heard the cessation of all ambient noise and felt a flicker of irritation. She assumed it was the principal about to make a pointless announcement over the PA system. She stood up from her desk, ready to march down the hall and complain about the interruption to her state-sanctioned punishment of a fanciful child. She opened her classroom door, a sharp retort already forming on her lips, and the words died in her throat. Her eyes widened, and the color drained from her face. Before her was a scene so far outside her realm of experience that her mind struggled to process it. The hallway was a river of dark blue and gold, a formal procession of military authority that had transformed the cheerful, poster-lined corridor into something solemn and formidable. At the head of it all was the woman, the captain, her eyes sweeping the hallway with a calm, analytical gaze that seemed to take in every detail, every exit, every potential threat, without betraying a single flicker of emotion. The teacher's gaze dropped from the captain's face to the 4 gold stripes on her sleeve, then to the rows of ribbons on her chest, a silver star, a bronze star with a V for valor, a purple heart, and a dozen others she couldn't begin to identify. Her mind reeled, trying to reconcile this image with the one she had so smugly constructed, the boxpacker, the warehouse worker, the subject of a child's silly lie. The arrogance and certainty that had buoyed her all day evaporated in an instant, replaced by a rising tide of cold, sickening dread. This was real. All of it. The captain's eyes finally settled on Ms. Albright, who was standing frozen in her own doorway. The gaze was not angry. It was not accusatory. It was worse. It was entirely neutral, the look of a superior officer assessing a piece of faulty equipment. In that moment, Ms. Albright felt herself shrink. Her entire sense of self, her identity as an authority figure, a gatekeeper of knowledge, crumbled into dust. She was nothing more than a functionary, a small, petty bureaucrat who had just made a catastrophic error in judgment in front of a power she could not comprehend. Lily, who had been sitting at a desk inside the classroom, heard the silence and stood up. She walked to the doorway and peered around the petrified form of her teacher. She saw her mother, and for the first time that day, a small, slow smile spread across her face. It was not a smile of triumph or glee. It was a smile of pure, simple vindication. Her world had been thrown off its axis, and now it was being set right. The captain's neutral expression softened for a fraction of a second as her eyes met her daughter's, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Then, her professional mask was back in place. Her demonstration was complete. Not a shot had been fired, not a voice had been raised, but an undeniable truth had been asserted with the force of a tectonic plate shifting. Competence had arrived, and it needed no introduction. Mr. Miller, the principal, finally managed to unstick his feet from the floor of his office. He scurried into the hallway, his face a mess of confusion, panic, and a desperate desire to appear in control of a situation that was so far beyond his authority, it was laughable. He approached the formation, his hands fluttering nervously. Can I help you?" he stammered, his voice a squeak in the cavernous silence. He directed his question vaguely toward the imposing admiral who stood just behind the captain. It was the admiral who stepped forward, his presence seeming to suck the remaining air from the corridor. He was a man accustomed to speaking in rooms where his words could shift the balance of global power, and he brought that same weight to the hallway of Northwood Elementary. He didn't look at the principal. His eyes, cold and sharp as chips of ice, were fixed on Ms. Albright, who was still frozen in her classroom doorway. "Principal Miller." The admiral's voice was a low, powerful baritone that needed no amplification. It was the sound of command. "This is Captain Eva Rostova, United States Navy. I am Admiral Thorne, Commander, Naval Special Warfare Command. We have reason to believe her daughter, Lily Rostova, is a student here." The principal nodded dumbly, unable to form a coherent sentence. Admiral Thorne continued, his tone flat and dangerously calm. "Captain Rostova has just concluded a 2-day classified briefing with the Joint Chiefs at the Pentagon regarding emerging global threats. Her testimony will likely influence national security policy for the next decade. She was on her way to Andrews Air Force Base to return to her command in Coronado when she requested a brief, unscheduled stop. These men," he gestured with a subtle tilt of his head to the silent warriors arrayed behind him, "are her senior command staff and team leaders from Naval Special Warfare Group 1. They are some of the most decorated and effective special operators in the history of the United States military. They insisted on escorting their commanding officer personally. The reveal landed with the force of an artillery shell. Each piece of information was a payload of truth, systematically demolishing the flimsy structure of Ms. Albright's ignorant assumptions. Joint Chiefs, National Security Policy, Commanding Officer. The words echoed in the hallway, rewriting reality itself. The admiral then took a single, deliberate step toward Ms. Albright, and for the first time, he addressed her directly. His voice dropped even lower, becoming a precise, surgical instrument of rebuke. "Ma'am, my office received a report regarding an incident that occurred during your career day presentation." He let the term hang in the air, dripping with disdain. "I was informed that you publicly questioned not only Captain Rostova's service, but her very rank, a rank she has earned through 22 years of honorable service, multiple combat deployments, and a level of personal sacrifice you cannot possibly imagine. You dismissed her as a liar. You punished her child for telling the truth. Let me correct the record, so that your ignorance is not permitted to fester." The admiral paused, letting the weight of his words press down on the teacher. "Captain Eva Rostova does not pack boxes she plans and leads the most critical and sensitive special operations missions on the planet. The men standing behind me, men who have faced down threats that would turn your blood to ice, follow her orders without question, not because of the rank on her collar, but because of the unwavering competence and moral clarity she demonstrates every single day. The title you mocked as not real is one she has defined. She is not just a captain in the Navy. She is a foundational pillar of the modern SEAL teams. The disrespect you showed her daughter was not a simple classroom grievance. It was an insult to the uniform of the United States Navy, to the memory of every operator who has fallen under command, and to the very concept of service itself. You made an assumption, and in our line of work, ma'am, assumptions get people killed. The verbal annihilation was complete. The admiral then turned his back on the now trembling teacher, faced Captain Rostova, and executed a slow, formal, breathtakingly respectful salute. Captain, the word was a benediction. Rostova, her face a mask of professional calm, returned the salute with a snap of her arm that was both elegant and deadly serious. And then, a sound like a single clap of thunder. The 40 operators, moving as one organism, raised their hands in a unified salute, their white gloves a blur of motion. The sound of their palms striking their headwear echoed through the school, a final, undeniable validation. Respect had been paid. The record had been corrected. The silence that followed the unified salute was somehow even more profound than the silence that had preceded it. It was a vacuum, cleared of all doubt, all arrogance, all ignorance. In that void, the only thing that remained was the unassailable truth of Captain Eva Rostova's identity. Ms. Albright leaned against her doorframe, her legs threatening to give way. The Admiral's words had not just been a reprimand. They had been a complete deconstruction of her worldview. Her entire life had been lived within the safe, predictable confines of rules, textbooks, and established social hierarchies. She had always believed she understood the world. Now, she realized she had been looking at it through a pinhole. The real world, the world of consequence and sacrifice inhabited by people like Captain Rostova, was a vast, dangerous, and noble landscape she had never even known existed. Her petty tyranny over a classroom of 10-year-olds seemed so pathetic, so meaningless, in the face of this monumental reality. She looked at Lily, who was now standing beside her mother. The captain had placed a gentle hand on her daughter's shoulder, a small, quiet gesture of ownership and protection. There was no "I told you so" in Lily's eyes, no childish gloating. There was only a calm, steady certainty. She had never doubted her mother, not for a second. Her faith had been absolute, a perfect reflection of the trust the men in the hallway placed in their commander. The scene began to break apart with the same quiet efficiency with which it had assembled. Captain Rostova murmured something to the Admiral, who nodded. "We are on a tight schedule, Principal," Admiral Thorne said, his voice returning to a more neutral, administrative tone, though the steel remained just beneath the surface. "Captain Rostova would like to sign her daughter out for the remainder of the day. I trust her detention has been rescinded." Mr. Miller, jolted back into action, nodded so vigorously his head seemed to wobble. "Yes, of course, absolutely, Admiral. Whatever you need. Please, right this way." He began to lead them toward the main office, practically tripping over his own feet in his haste to be accommodating. Captain Rostova paused and looked directly at Ms. Albright one last time. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her gaze held a universe of meaning. It was not a look of anger, but one of profound disappointment. It was the look of a professional who had encountered an amateur, of a leader who had witnessed a failure of judgment so complete it bordered on the surreal. Then, she turned and, with her hand still on Lily's shoulder, followed the principal. The two platoons of SEALs performed a flawless about-face and began to file out of the school, their footsteps once again a single, unified rhythm. They moved past Ms. Albright's classroom, their faces impassive, their eyes fixed forward. None of them looked at her. To them, she was an obstacle that had been cleared, a tactical problem that had been solved. She was irrelevant. This, more than the Admiral's verbal lashing, was the cruelest blow. To be so thoroughly and completely dismissed by men of such consequence was a judgment from which there was no appeal. She was nothing. Her assumptions were nothing. Her authority was a laughable fiction. As the last operator cleared the doorway, the normal sounds of the world began to seep back into the hallway. The hum of the lights, the distant drone of the floor buffer, the ticking of a clock on the wall. The world was the same, but for Ms. Albright, it had been irrevocably and fundamentally altered. She slid down the doorframe and sat heavily on the floor, the red grating pen falling from her limp hand and rolling away, leaving a small, bloody-looking streak on the polished linoleum. The story of the captain and her silent warriors did not just spread, it detonated. Before the black SUVs had even cleared the school district, cell phone videos, blurry and shot from trembling hands, were already hitting social media. The tale leaped from school gossip circles to local news forums, then to national military blogs, and finally into the insatiable maw of the global internet. It became a modern legend, a piece of contemporary folklore that resonated with a deep, primal need to see quiet competence triumph over loud-mouthed arrogance. The narrative was perfect: the underestimated child, the cynical gatekeeper, and the quiet professional whose very presence was a weapon of truth. Within 48 hours, the Northwood correction was a trending topic. Memes were born. A picture of Captain Rostova's stoic face with the caption, "My letter of complaint has arrived," a shot of the SEALs in formation with the text, "Career Day, Expert Level." The school's name was now inextricably linked with this single, incredible event. Northwood Elementary was no longer just a school. It was a landmark, the site of a legendary takedown. For Ms. Albright, the aftermath was a personal and professional crucible. She was not fired. Captain Rostova, in a quiet call to the superintendent, had specifically requested that she not be. "She made a mistake," the captain had said, her voice devoid of emotion. "Now she has an opportunity to learn from it." Firing her teaches nothing. This act of clemency was, in its own way, more devastating than any official punishment. It was a final, quiet lesson in leadership. True strength builds up, it doesn't just tear down. Ms. Albright was placed on administrative leave for 2 weeks. She spent that time in her silent, lonely house, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her face as she fell down the digital rabbit hole of her own infamy. She read the articles. She saw the memes. She read the biographies of the men who had stood in her hallway. She learned about their sacrifices, their training, their ethos. She spent 3 straight days reading everything she could find about the history of women in special operations, about the quiet, brutal, uphill battle they had fought for a place at the table. She read about Captain Eva Rostova, tracing the publicly available breadcrumbs of a mostly classified career, Annapolis graduate, top of her class. First female officer to complete BUD/S training as an official observer. Groundbreaking doctrinal papers on asymmetric warfare. A list of awards that could fill a display case. She realized with a dawning, sickening horror that she hadn't just insulted a parent. She had dismissed a historical figure. When she returned to her classroom, she was a different person. The brittle certainty was gone, replaced by a deep and unsettling humility. She looked at her students not as empty vessels to be filled with state-approved facts, but as unknown quantities, individuals with lives and families and stories she couldn't possibly comprehend. Her first act back was to stand before her class and offer a formal, public apology to Lily, who was not in attendance. Then she wrote a letter, long and heartfelt, addressed to Captain Rostova, care of the Department of the Navy. She didn't know if it would ever be read, but she knew she had to write it. It was a confession, an act of penance, and a promise to do better. The legend of the event, meanwhile, took on a life of its own. At the school, it became an institutional touchstone. The hallway where the SEALs had formed up was unofficially nicknamed the Line of Respect. Students would walk through it with a certain reverence. The story became a powerful tool for teachers to discuss the dangers of prejudice and the importance of humility. It was more effective than any textbook chapter or standardized curriculum. It was real. It was their story. The transformation of Ms. Albright was the most immediate ripple effect, but the true legacy of that day continued to spread, changing the very culture of the school and the community it served. The teacher who had once been a purveyor of cynicism became an unlikely champion for a new kind of education, one rooted in curiosity rather than judgment. She scrapped her old Career Day model entirely. In its place, she spearheaded the creation of the Northwood Speaker Series, a program designed to bring in people from all walks of life, not just the safe and predictable professions, but veterans, artists, explorers, and entrepreneurs, to share their stories. Her new mantra, repeated often to her students and fellow faculty, was simple: assume you know nothing. Then, start listening. She became the program's most ardent supporter, her past shame now fueling a passionate mission to prevent others from making her same mistake. She had learned, in the most public and humiliating way possible, that the world was infinitely more complex and astonishing than she had ever allowed herself to believe. Captain Rostova, for her part, remained a distant, almost mythical figure. She never returned to the school. She never publicly commented on the incident. Her silence on the matter only amplified her legend. She had appeared, corrected a fundamental injustice with overwhelming but quiet force, and then disappeared back into the classified world she inhabited. Her only further communication with the school was a single, typed letter that arrived at the principal's office a month after the event. It was a simple note of thanks for their understanding and a check for $5,000, personally donated to the school library with the instruction that it be used to purchase books on history, leadership, and diverse biographies. It was signed simply, Rostova, Captain, USN. The note and the check were a final, masterclass lesson in her character. No ego, no fanfare, just a quiet, productive action aimed at fostering the very understanding that had been so lacking. Lily Rostova, of course, became a quiet celebrity among her peers. The other children now looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect. They peppered her with questions about her mother, which she answered with the same simple, direct honesty she had from the beginning. "Is she a spy?" one boy asked. "No," Lily replied. "She's a captain." She never boasted. She never lorded her newfound status over those who had mocked her. She simply continued to be herself, quiet, observant, and possessed of a calm self-assurance that was far beyond her years. She carried the truth of who her mother was not as a weapon to be wielded, but as a shield, an internal source of strength that made the opinions of others irrelevant. The photograph of her mother in the flight suit found a permanent home, pinned to the bulletin board in the main office, right next to the school's mission statement. It became a silent, constant reminder, a symbol. It was a picture of a quiet professional, a woman whose competence needed no advertisement, a leader whose authority was absolute because it was earned, not demanded. The artifact cemented the story into the very architecture of the school, ensuring it would not be forgotten. It was a warning against assumption and a tribute to the quiet strength that so often goes unseen. A year passed. The seasons turned. A new class of fifth graders filled the halls, but the story remained, now woven into the fabric of the school's identity. The Captain Rostova Leadership Award was officially established, funded by an anonymous endowment that everyone knew came from the Navy's special warfare community. The award was not for the student with the best grades or the most athletic talent. The criteria, drafted by a committee that included a newly invigorated Ms. Albright, were for the student who best demonstrates integrity, humility, and the courage to stand for the truth, especially when it is unpopular. It was the school's most prestigious honor. The first recipient was a quiet girl who had stood up to a group of bullies picking on a new student, not by fighting, but by simply standing between them, refusing to move, her silent defiance shaming them into retreat. When her name was called, the entire auditorium erupted in applause. Ms. Albright, watching from the side of the stage, felt a swell of pride that was entirely new to her. It wasn't the brittle, self-satisfied pride of being right, but the deep, resonant pride of having been a part of something that created a positive, lasting change. She had been humbled, and in that humbling, she had found a better version of herself. The story became a teaching parable, a foundational myth for every new student and faculty member. On orientation day, Principal Miller would stand before the new teachers and tell the tale, not as a point of shame, but as a crucial lesson in their professional responsibility. "Your job is not to enforce your version of reality," he would say. "It is to open your students' minds to possibilities you can't even imagine. Look at every child who walks through your door and remember that you have no idea who they are, where they come from, or the legacy they carry. Your assumption is the least reliable tool you have. Your curiosity is the most valuable." The legend was a shield against cynicism, a permanent inoculation against the kind of lazy prejudice that had led to the incident in the first place. The hallway, the line of respect, was now where the school's honor roll and student awards were displayed. It had been transformed from a simple corridor into a space of reverence, a place to celebrate quiet achievement and moral courage. The story of Captain Rostova had become more than just an anecdote. It was now an operating principle. It had fundamentally and permanently altered the school's DNA, creating a culture where listening was valued more than speaking, and where respect was understood to be a function of character, not volume. The quiet professional had left behind a legacy of profound and enduring resonance, proving that the most powerful lessons are often delivered without raising one's voice. The ripples of that single, quiet demonstration of competence were still spreading, growing wider and stronger, changing the small world of Northwood Elementary for the better, forever. The true measure of a legacy is not in the recounting of a single, dramatic event, but in the quiet, daily continuation of the principles it established. Years later, Northwood Elementary was a different place. The culture of quiet respect had become so ingrained that it was simply the way things were. The Captain Rostova Leadership Award was a cherished tradition, its recipients forming a long line of students recognized for their integrity. The story was told and retold, not as a sensational piece of gossip, but as a foundational text, a reminder of the school's core values. It served as a constant warning that the person standing before you, no matter how small or unassuming, might carry a weight of experience and a depth of character that would stagger you if you only knew. It taught that competence is quiet, that strength does not need to announce itself, and that the most profound authority is the kind that is simply recognized, not demanded. The narrative championed the silent, the steady, the professional, over the loud, the arrogant, and the ignorant. It was a lesson in the immense power of showing, not telling. Captain Eva Rostova was never seen at the school again. She remained a name, a face in a photograph, a legend. Her legacy was not in her physical presence, but in the standard she had set. It was in Ms. Albright, now a beloved veteran teacher, who guided her students with a gentle, questioning wisdom. It was in the students who learned to look past surface appearances and listen for the content of someone's character. It was in the very air of the school, which was now charged with a sense of possibility, a belief that greatness could be found in the most unexpected places. True legacy isn't what you leave behind in a flurry of headlines and viral moments. It is what continues to move forward in the quiet, daily actions of others, long after you have departed the scene. It is the permanent installation of a better idea. The captain had come to correct a single injustice, but she had left behind a framework for a more just world. Her brief, silent, and overwhelmingly powerful visit had become an enduring lesson, a quiet source of inspiration that would shape generations of students to come, teaching them to respect the silence, to honor competence, and to never, ever underestimate the quiet person in the room. For more stories where quiet integrity triumphs over loud ignorance, and where silent competence defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.